Saleswoman fired for sheltering an elderly man, but the millionaire who arrived shocked everyone. The rain fell like an endless veil over the city, soaking the gleaming cobblestones of Fifth Avenue. The storefront lights blazed with arrogance, as if wanting to compete with the stars that couldn't manage to peek through that night. Behind the impeccable glass of the Magnolia boutique, a world of sweet perfumes, fine velvets, and impatient clients pulsed with a rhythm indifferent to the cold outside. But in a corner of the counter, behind a delicate smile, Elena's eyes couldn't hide the sadness that had inhabited her for some time. She was barely 27 years old, but her gaze carried decades of resignation. Her dark hair fell like silk over the shoulders of her immaculate blouse, and her hands sometimes trembled as she wrapped the purchases of the most demanding clients in luxury paper. That afternoon, however, something different kept her restless, as if she sensed that the rain wasn't the only storm approaching. While her co-workers chatted with superficial laughter, Elena couldn't take her eyes off the store's back door. There, through a small fogged window, she had caught sight of the hunched silhouette of an elderly man who, under the downpour, was trying to protect himself with nothing more than a soaked newspaper over his head. Her heart skipped a beat. It was just a fleeting second, the image of an older man, defenseless, trembling on the edge of collapse while the world ignored him. Elena pressed her lips together. In that instant, the boutique, with all its opulence, seemed like an insult to humanity. She tried to convince herself it wasn't her business, that she was just another saleswoman in a machine that didn't allow her to deviate from the script. But her conscience's voice was stronger. Her mother used to tell her as a child, a person's true worth is measured by how they treat those who can give them nothing in return. And that voice resonated like thunder in her chest. The boutique lights flickered, the manager shot her sideways glances, the customers demanded attention. But Elena had already made her decision without even fully knowing it. She took a step toward the back door with slightly sweaty hands and a mixture of fear and determination that made her feel more alive than she had been in years. In the silence before the storm, with the rain lashing the windows and the inert mannequins watching like silent witnesses, Elena couldn't imagine that her small gesture of compassion was about to unleash an irreversible change. The most beautiful stories usually begin when someone decides to listen to their heart, even if the whole world seems to oppose it. And if you also believe that the heart still has a place in a world like this, subscribe right now so you don't miss the stories that will restore your faith in second chances. The back door's latch creaked when Elena pushed carefully, trying not to draw anyone's attention. A freezing breath entered the stockroom, making her skin crawl despite the coat she wore. Outside, the rain now fell harder, drawing puddles and streams that ran along the street floor. There, barely protected by the building's cornice, he was an elderly man with his back turned, sitting on an empty box, with his hands buried in the pockets of his worn grey coat. He was thinner than he appeared through the glass. His white hair was plastered to his forehead by moisture, and the skin of his cheeks was reddened by the cold. When he heard the door open, he turned his head with a slow gesture, like someone who no longer expects anything good from anyone. Elena held her breath when she met his gaze, tired eyes, but still full of silent dignity. He didn't say a word, just observed her with a mixture of surprise and wariness, as if wondering why a stranger was paying attention to him. "You're soaked," she whispered, without thinking, barely audible to herself. Without asking permission, she took a step outside, feeling how the water wet her shoes and seeped through her stockings. She crouched next to him, extending a clean napkin she had brought from the store. The elderly man accepted it with clumsy fingers, though he seemed more worried about not inconveniencing her than about his own condition. Just for a moment, Elena told him with a small smile, trying to give him confidence. "You can come into the stockroom, dry off a bit. No one will see you." At first he shook his head, murmuring something unintelligible, as if he were used to having doors closed on him. But then his legs faltered, and she instinctively supported him by the arm. That simple contact was enough to convince him that he didn't have the strength to keep enduring the rain. With slow steps she led him inside, closing the door behind them so no one in the boutique would see them. The stockroom smelled of cardboard and cologne, and was lit by a single yellow bulb. Elena helped the elderly man sit on a folding chair and offered him a blanket they always kept there for cold days. As he covered his shoulders with trembling hands, she felt a knot in her throat. Why could the world be so cruel to those who needed care most? She couldn't help but imagine her own grandfather years ago, wandering through the city when his memory began to fail. And although she knew she could get in trouble, that the manager was ruthless and wouldn't tolerate a stain on the boutique's reputation, Elena wasn't willing to turn her back on this man. Through the half-open door she heard laughter and hurried footsteps in the main store. She still had time. She breathed deeply and went to get a cup of hot tea for the elderly man. At that moment, she couldn't imagine that someone was already watching her from the hallway, with narrowed eyes and a frozen smile on their lips. The bravest decisions are sometimes made in silence, without witnesses, and they always carry a question with them: will the price I'll have to pay be worth it? The tea's steam rose in delicate spirals while Elena held the cup in her hands, trying to keep her pulse steady. Every second, she felt anxiety climbing up her chest like a thorn vine. She knew she couldn't take much longer. It would only take someone entering the stockroom unannounced for everything to fall apart. She leaned down to offer the cup to the elderly man, who received it with a thread of hoarse voice. "Thank you, daughter." That unexpected daughter made her smile, though her eyes began to sting with emotion. Mr. Harold, because that's what he said his name was, with the dignity of someone who's ashamed of nothing except being a bother, sipped the tea with trembling hands and heavy eyelids. In his gaze was something that disturbed her, a mixture of resignation and gratitude so deep it almost hurt to see. "It's so cold out there," he murmured, "and nobody looks at those of us on the ground." Elena felt a different chill from Winters. Was it possible that no one else had seen him out there, under the rain, or had they all preferred to look the other way? As she asked herself these questions, she heard footsteps approaching down the hallway. Her heart stopped. The curtain separating the stockroom from the main store barely moved. A shadow projected on the floor. Elena stood up abruptly and turned toward the door with a forced smile, as if nothing were happening, but the manager didn't fall for her attempt at disguise. "What is this?" the woman said with a cutting voice, pulling the curtain aside with a jerk. In a matter of seconds, the silence became unbearable. Elena's co-workers, who had peeked behind the manager, stared at her open-mouthed. The elderly man looked up, ashamed, and began to stand slowly to leave. But Elena didn't move. She was afraid, yes, but there was something in her, perhaps the same voice that pushed her to open the back door, that prevented her from backing down. She couldn't leave him alone now. The manager let out a dry laugh. "Well, what a spectacle. A saleswoman playing Sister of Charity in my store." She raised an eyebrow with disdain. "This is unacceptable, Elena. You no longer work here." The words pierced her like a knife, and yet, something inside her remained firm. With the elderly man leaning on her arm, Elena felt more human, more alive than ever. She knew the price was high, but there was no turning back now. "And now tell me, would you have also risked your job to help someone? Leave it in the comments. I want to know if there's still compassion left in this world." The customers, curious as birds in a market, began to cluster near the stockroom's threshold. The murmurs grew, like a swarm of bees hungry for scandal. The manager, proud of her small victory, crossed her arms while a cruel smile formed on her face. "Look at her," she said loudly, making sure everyone heard. "This is what happens when someone thinks they're more important than the store. What will clients say if they see we're harboring vagrants in our facilities?" Elena remained standing next to Mr. Harold, helping him stay upright while he tried at least to hide his shame by lowering his gaze to the floor. Each of the manager's words echoed against the walls of his dignity. She looked at him and felt anger instead of fear. "He doesn't dirty this store more than people who treat others like trash," she finally said, without raising her voice too much, but with enough firmness to resonate in the room. There was a murmur of surprise among the saleswomen. No one spoke to the manager like that. For an instant, even the woman was left speechless, but only for an instant. "Out, now," she ordered, pointing to the main door with a finger like a dagger. Elena took a deep breath. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She leaned toward Mr. Harold with a calm gesture and helped him stand completely. No one helped her collect her coat or her few belongings. No one defended her. They left her alone with her decision. As she walked through the store with her head held high and the elderly man by her side, the customers looked away, and the other saleswomen stepped aside, as if they feared catching her misfortune. The murmur continued, a litany of reproaches and gossip that no longer mattered to her. The world had reduced itself to her and the man who now looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. The boutique's glass doors opened, and the rain welcomed them again. Elena held the umbrella for him, covering him first. As they advanced under the storm, a dark car, discreet but elegant in appearance, stopped in front of the entrance. The vehicle's rear doors opened and a male figure descended slowly, adjusting the collar of his wool coat. He was tall, with an intense gaze and determined steps. No one seemed to recognize him at first, but his mere presence changed the boutique's atmosphere in an instant. The customers fell silent. The saleswomen straightened up, and the manager, with a startled gesture, took a step back. The man observed them both, Elena and the elderly man, under the rain. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made the air seem heavier. At that moment, the story took a turn that no one there could have imagined. The silence that fell when the man entered the boutique was so thick, anyone could have cut it with their hands. The rain continued hammering against the windows, but inside only the tapping of his shoes on the marble floor could be heard. Each of his steps seemed calculated, deliberate, as if he already knew exactly where he was going and whom he was looking for. Gabriel stopped a few meters from the entrance, without bothering to dry the rain from his hair or dark coat. His eyes, deep and serene, surveyed the scene, the manager stiff as a statue, the employees pretending to be busy, the customers holding their breath, and finally his pupils fixed on Elena and Mr. Harold, still standing at the sidewalk's edge, with the umbrella tilted and their dignity wounded. There was an instant when no one dared to move. The manager was the first to react, composing a forced smile while smoothing her suit. She walked toward him with nervous steps, never stopping watching him with a mixture of respect and fear. "Welcome, sir," she greeted, lowering her voice as if speaking to someone too important to be interrupted. "We weren't expecting you today. What a pleasant surprise." Gabriel didn't look at her. His attention remained fixed on Elena, which only increased the tension in the room. The manager kept talking, trying to fill the silence with hurried explanations. "Just a small incident, nothing to worry about," she said with a dry giggle, pointing at the elderly man with disdain. "We're already handling it. This employee doesn't understand basic conduct rules and, well," Gabriel raised his hand, a minimal gesture, but enough to silence her instantly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was grave and firm with a tone that froze everyone present. "What did you say?" The manager swallowed, clumsy, unable to hold his gaze. "That we were handling the incident. She brought him here." For the first time since he entered, Gabriel barely turned his head to observe her, with an almost imperceptible gleam in his eyes, a gleam that wasn't anger, but something more unfathomable. The saleswomen exchanged nervous glances, the customers retreated discreetly toward the corners. Elena, for her part, kept her eyes down, fearful of making things worse, but unable to abandon Mr. Harold. Her heart beat strongly, as if something inside her was screaming that this stranger was about to change everything. Gabriel took another step, crossing the distance between them. He stopped in front of Elena, so close she could perceive the faint aroma of his cologne and the confidence that emanated from his bearing. For the first time that night, his voice softened, almost to a whisper. "Was it you who decided to help him?" Elena nodded slowly, without lifting her gaze, with her cheeks burning with shame and pride at the same time. And then something strange happened. Gabriel smiled, not a wide or fake smile, but barely a slight gesture at the corner of his lips, loaded with an intention no one there fully understood. What he said next would make everyone hold their breath. The silence in the boutique was almost unbearable. The rain continued its symphony outside, like a sound curtain for what was about to happen. Everyone held their breath while Gabriel held Elena's gaze, who remained standing, defiant and vulnerable at the same time. "What's your name?" he asked, with a low but clear voice. "Elena," she answered, barely a thread of voice, finally daring to lift her eyes. Gabriel held her gaze a few more seconds and then, with a gesture as elegant as it was cold, barely turned his face toward the manager. "She," he said, in a firm tone, "did the right thing." The collective murmur was inevitable. The manager blinked, as if she didn't understand what she had just heard. "Excuse me, sir, but this is unacceptable," she tried to reply, wavering. "In this store we have an image to maintain. You can't allow compassion." Gabriel interrupted, now with a frozen smile on his lips. "I know, that's why I'm here. The manager paled while he advanced slowly through the store, his steps resonating like sentence bells. He stopped in the center of the salon, where everyone could see him, and turned toward those present. "My name is Gabriel," he announced, finally, "and I own this boutique chain." A louder murmur ran through the room, followed by an even more overwhelming silence. The manager stepped back, unable to articulate a word. The employees lowered their gazes, and the customers looked at each other with bulging eyes. Gabriel continued, his voice calm, but loaded with an authority no one dared to challenge. "Today I came unannounced because I wanted to see with my own eyes how people were treated here." His gaze stopped on the manager with harshness. "And I've already seen it." Then he softened his tone when turning his sight back to Elena and Mr. Harold. "But I've also seen who still remembers what matters." The manager attempted one last defense, her voice trembling. "But sir, she broke the rules." Gabriel raised his hand, commanding silence. "Rules are not above humanity. If these stores mean anything, it must be because those who run them know how to distinguish between appearance and heart. And you," he looked at her with disdain, "no longer have a place here." The manager opened her mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come out. She knew she was finished. She knew there was no return after that look. Gabriel turned back toward Elena, sketching that slight and almost imperceptible smile, like a flash of tenderness hidden behind the armor. "You, on the other hand, still have much to teach us." And with that, the room's tension transformed into amazement, and in Elena's eyes something began to germinate that she didn't remember feeling in years: hope. The employees began to disperse slowly, murmuring among themselves, unable to take their eyes off the scene. The manager, defeated and red with shame, disappeared toward the office without daring to reply another word. The customers stayed for a moment, pretending to browse through the racks while trying to understand what they had just witnessed. But for Elena, the world had reduced itself to one person. Gabriel looked at her with an intensity so serene it almost hurt. There was in his eyes an ancient shadow, as if he hid his own winters under that impeccable armor of an untouchable millionaire. She held it with the same humility and strength that had made her give shelter to an elderly man under the rain. He made a discreet gesture with his head toward the stockroom, inviting her to follow him. Elena nodded, and taking Mr. Harold by the arm, walked with Gabriel toward the silent corner where just minutes before her tragedy had begun. Once there, away from curious gazers, Gabriel spoke with a lower, more intimate voice. "My father died alone on a park bench, years ago," he confessed, with his eyes lost in a memory he didn't dare fully name. He had all the money he could need, but no one to hold him when he could no longer stand up. Elena looked at him with a mixture of surprise and compassion. He continued, without taking his eyes off hers. "Since then I promised I wouldn't allow another man to go through that, not if I could prevent it." In that instant, she understood why there was no anger in him, why he had smiled when he learned she risked everything for someone else. Gabriel was seeing her not just as a rebellious employee, but as a kind of reflection of his own broken heart. Mr. Harold, sitting in the chair, watched them in silence, with a grateful gleam in his tired gaze. There was something almost sacred in that small triangle of wounded souls meeting in a boutique stockroom. Gabriel leaned barely toward Elena, his voice now softer, almost a whisper. "You don't know how much I needed to find someone like you." The words floated between them like orange blossom petals, sweet and fragile. And she, for the first time in years, felt that someone not only saw her but understood her. He straightened slowly, putting the mask of calm back on his face, but before turning, he gave her another of those imperceptible smiles that said more than 1,000 speeches. Sometimes, those who seem strongest are the ones who carry the most hidden wounds, and sometimes, a single gesture of humanity is enough to tear down the highest walls. When they returned to the main store, the atmosphere was still charged with murmurs and tension. The customers pretended to examine dresses, but their eyes didn't leave them. The employees remained rigid behind the counter, waiting for some order. The manager, now sitting in a corner with downcast eyes, was barely a shadow of her initial arrogance. Gabriel stopped in the middle of the salon and turned to face everyone. His mere presence commanded respect, and for the first time that boutique, with all its superficial luxury, felt tiny compared to the greatness of a single act of courage. "Listen to me well," he said, with a firm but serene voice. "From this moment on, Elena not only gets her position back in this store, but will be the new general manager." A muffled murmur ran through the salon. No one dared to say anything out loud. Gabriel didn't seem interested in the reactions. His eyes remained on her, as if everything else didn't exist. She, he continued, pointing at her without looking away, has taught me today what it truly means to represent this brand: humanity, courage, and compassion. Elena looked at him, astonished, with trembling hands and flushed cheeks. That decision not only surprised her but seemed to shake the very walls of the place. The employees lowered their heads, ashamed. The customers, uncomfortable, began to leave in silence, and the manager, defeated, had no choice but to get up and leave the store with the echo of her heels resonating like a sad goodbye. Gabriel then approached Elena, extended his hand and helped her climb onto the small platform where the most expensive dresses were normally displayed. Now, under the white lights of the storefront, she was the one who shone. "I want you to always remember," he told her in a low voice, "that there is no greater luxury in the world than a noble heart." The employees applauded timidly, first one, then two, until the entire room broke into applause. Elena smiled through tears, feeling proud of herself for the first time in a long time. Gabriel stayed by her side, his fingers barely brushing hers with an intimate and subtle gesture, but enough for warmth to run through her veins. Sometimes, a single decision can change not just one life, but many. And if this story touched your heart as much as it did theirs, don't forget to leave your like right now, because acts of kindness also deserve to be celebrated. That night, when the boutique finally closed its doors and the storefront lights went out one by one, the rain had already surrendered, leaving in its place a fresh and clean air that permeated the streets. Elena stood alone at the entrance for a moment, holding the store key in her hand, like someone holding a new destiny without yet knowing what to do with it. Mr. Harold, wrapped in a blanket that now seemed lighter on his shoulders, looked at her with grateful eyes from the sidewalk. He had insisted he could leave on his own, but she didn't let him go without promising he would return to visit her to say hello and tell her how he was doing. He blessed her in a whisper before disappearing among the quiet shadows of the street. When Elena turned to go back inside and collect her things, she found Gabriel leaning against the door frame, hands in his pockets and that same slight smile on his lips. He looked at her calmly, as if he had been waiting for exactly that moment. "I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye," he said, and his voice sounded low, almost intimate, in the night's silence. She lowered her gaze for a second, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened, but something inside her was beginning to relax, like a knot that finally comes undone. "You don't have to thank me for anything," he added, as if reading her thoughts. "Today, you reminded me why it's worth continuing to believe in people." They walked together down the sidewalk without a fixed direction, while she listened to his story. Gabriel told her about his lonely childhood, his absent father, how he had inherited a fortune and a chain of stores, but also an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. He confessed that many times he felt like Mr. Harold, invisible, despite everything he had. She listened to him in silence, feeling how each of his words gave back some humanity to that man whom everyone feared and admired from afar. And for the first time in a long time, Elena felt that someone not only saw her from the outside, but from the inside, where her fears, dreams, and intact dignity lived. When they stopped at a corner, he turned toward her, with his face illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp. "I'd like you to accept an invitation," he said, with an almost shy tone in his voice. "Not just to talk about work, but so we can continue getting to know each other." Elena blinked, surprised, but felt no fear or doubts. Only a strange certainty that this man, with all his complexity, had come to stay in her life. She nodded, with a small smile, and he returned a look so warm that for an instant all the winter's cold seemed to vanish. Sometimes, broken souls recognize each other in the crowd. Sometimes, destiny brings them together under the rain so they can support each other when the world no longer expects anything from them. The following days were like an awakening. The boutique reopened, but it was no longer the same. The employees' looks toward Elena had changed, not from fear, but from respect. The customers now called her by name, and people passing by sometimes stopped to see how she herself, from behind the counter, attended with a serenity no one had noticed before. But the deepest change wasn't in the boutique, it was in her. In the evenings, Elena would meet again with Gabriel, walking under the light rain of the spring that was already showing. Sometimes they met in front of a tiny cafe and stayed until late talking about life, mistakes, second chances. Other times, he would come by the store to pick her up when it closed. and together they would get lost in New York's quiet streets, like two teenagers just beginning to discover love. Because that's what it was, love. A shy, silent, but deep love, the kind that doesn't need to shout to exist. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Gabriel stopped and took her hand delicately. "You know something," he said, with a slight smile. "That day, the day of the storm, it wasn't me who saved you." Elena looked at him, confused. "It was you who saved me." She felt tears fill her eyes, but this time not from sadness, but from gratitude so immense, it barely fit in her chest. His hands closed over hers, warm, secure, and for the first time in a long time Elena stopped feeling that the world was against her. There was no more loneliness, no more fear, only the certainty that sometimes a single act of kindness is enough to change not just one destiny, but two. As the sun set and the city lit its first lights, she rested her head on his shoulder and breathed deeply, feeling that, at last, she had found her place. Sometimes, happy endings don't come as we dream them. Sometimes, they're better. And you, who have accompanied this story to the end, also deserve an ending like this. Because life always saves second chances for those who have the courage to keep believing in the heart. So subscribe to the channel right now, and don't let the next stories that can transform your day or your life slip away. And remember, there's always room for hope.